Hello and welcome to my workshop. So today we're going to be getting back on the Ford COE RatRod, and so we're going to take this cab that we've worked on. We're also going to be creating the back section and the rear fenders, finding a spot for this little engine, and then possibly figuring out how to get the chassis with these axles. Alright, so let's get started. So I'm trying to come out with the dimensions for this, and I don't need anything exact, but I'm just trying to lay the parts out in close approximation of where they're going to exist, and then start to make some panels. So not as typical, what I'm using here is a really thin plywood, and I'm not really sure. I think this is like for making little plaques and stuff. I got it at the hobby store. But it's a really fine, really thin, strong, and you know, very well made plywood. So no super carpentry skills here, just using some super glue and getting the things tacked together. So I wanted to have kind of a angle iron look to the edge of it, so that it looked like there was a, you know, kind of an angle iron frame with wood panels that were bolted in, which is, you know, mocking up, you know, close to the original one. So I'm adding these styrene strips onto the side to emulate that. And you can see I'm spaced the centerpiece down a bit. And by putting the you know, the plastic angle pieces on, it makes like a little ledge, a little lip. And what I'm going to end up doing is taking the some wooden strips and re-gluing those back in to look like planks on the top. They're just trying to get the corners, you know, mitered at 45, get them pretty close. I'm not really worried about having them perfectly line up. I'm not going to actually, you know, finish that section. I want it to look like it's, you know, like it's pretty rough. And I might even come back and add some scale welding marks on there later. Here, just laying some of these planks in at random lengths, and you're just gluing them straight down to the top. So these boards are actually from a dollhouse. It's the flooring of a dollhouse. It's a real pine flooring. It comes in these pretty large sheets. It has a thick paper backing, and so what I'm ending up doing is just kind of bending them over and cutting the paper. And what you end up with is these individual planks, which are good for making boxes or these tops here. So the sides I went with just a little bit thinner material, and it's still angled, but it's just I think it's like an 1/8 inch. And so just putting that on and then adding in some flat material to make it look like that was you know, sectioned. If you see, there's a plastic piece right in the center that's connecting the two. When I got these together, I realized it was a little too wide and a little too tall. So what I did is I went to the table saw after it was complete, you know, cut it in half, re-glued it back together, and put that spacer, that little plastic piece in the back to kind of bridge it. As you can see, I got the truck roughly mocked up here. I think this is pretty close to the ride height I'm going to go with. This is about 15 millimeters.
I might go a little bit lower, but I'm just worried about the size of this tire and being able to clear. You know, if I can go lower, I will. And it's probably going to have to do with whether or not this thing can clear and turn. But so in the in the front, you got the tire on the solid axle cab. This little bed piece I have created in the back out of wood. The scale engine in here, and a solid axle rear end that will go roughly right here. And we driven by a single-speed RC four-wheel drive transmission with a little cheap 10.5 turn brushless motor. And it'll be mounted, you know, up inside this box. But you know, roughly right here, which is a very, very short drive shaft going to the rear. I still have to come back and create the fender, so I'm just gonna have two kind of similar style fenders as the front here, you know, very bubbly and you know, kind of long in the back. So it'll probably come out to about, you know, I don't know, maybe right about here in the rear, and then just basically have a flat sheet that kind of contours the shape of those two fenders and connects them together, and then that'll all be connected into here. This will be one piece to come off. I need to get the chassis rails set up next and figure out what kind of suspension I want to put under this. Alright, so let's get to that. So this is the rear section of a Vatera chassis. And so what I'm going to end up doing is taking that rear section and cutting it and bending it over to get a much taller bend to go up around the axle. So this thing is going to be lowered, so I need that, you know, really high up in order to get the shock on there. So I'm trying to keep these bolted together and making the cuts at the same time. And you know, the idea is that both sides will match. So grafted onto this Vatera chassis is going to be some 3/4 inch box section, and that's just a tubing that's spliced right down the middle. And you know, I end up doing something similar to that as I bolted two pieces together, makes some cuts, bend it out, and then bend it back in. And when you turn it around, what you end up with is a chassis that's stepped in from the wide stance in the back to a much narrower stance in the front. Because I wasn't able to get the measurements spot on that front piece before I cut and split it, I just had to take a lot of really careful measurements to make sure I get my holes lined up right. I decided to do something pretty simple for mounting up the body. Just some aluminum brackets bolted to the side, some Velcro, and you're done. I'm really making some pretty good progress on this. It's kind of slow going because what I'm doing here is figuring it out as I go. Most of the time I have kind of a game plan sketched out. With this one, it's kind of a RatRod, and doing this two-wheel drive low stuff is a whole new game for me. So I'm just kind of having to learn as I go. I don't really have a good idea up front. So what I've been able to do is, you know, get the chassis all set up, you know, with the Vatera chassis in the back, notched and you know, moved up quite a bit to give me some clearance for some shocks. Now what I have in here right now is just a temporary piece of all thread to represent the shock, because that's still coming in the mail. Hopefully it'll get here soon. You know, got the transmission mounted, and then the front is just 3/4 inch box tubing. And what I've done is notched and narrowed the front end down. And so what that'll allow me to do is to
mount up this suspension here on the front. So in the back I have these little mounts with Velcro and then attached to the wooden box. And it's just kind of a snug fit all the way down, which will kind of help keep it centered. So when you get this down, push down on the Velcro, it'll go, roughly, somewhere in this. It might go forward and backwards a little bit. I do have a little bit of leeway, but I think this is the kind of the general place where it's going to reside. I have in here a little piece of popsicle stick that's cut just the right width, and what that'll do is end up replacing that with a piece of metal and use screw holes to go on the bottom here, and I'll make a bracket and take this screw out here. I'll probably have to re-tap that to a M3 thread. I might have to do that as well for this. So I think the next step is to work on the fenders in the rear and get those set up, and then we'll continue on with the chassis once I get that part done. Alright, let's get started. So now that the chassis is pretty close to being where I want it, I want to try to focus on getting the rear fenders. So I don't really know exactly where these rear fenders are from, or what kind of car or truck or whatever they would be. I just, they were on the Welderup truck, so I basically am coming up with some that are pretty close to that, but then just match up with whatever dimensionalities I need for my body here. So here I have all of the pieces together. Now, one side is glued together with super glue, and the other side is as well. But then they're attached down the middle with carpet tape, and so it allows me to get both of them sanded and shaped at the same time, and to be pretty accurate. And then I could just split that carpet tape apart, and I end up with two pieces that are pretty close. So one of the key features of this build is this big giant like a sheet metal piece that connects these two fenders and covers up the axle in the rear. So that's what I'm building here, is just adding in some wooden blocks that would be lined up with the outside, and I'm able to carve that down, end up with that sheet metal piece. So just like I said, that sheet metal piece that I made, gluing the two fenders to either side of that with the styrene solvent, a little bit of backer of super glue to hold it in place, and I can move forward. I'm not worrying too much about getting that top part lined up, because I want it to look like it's not quite perfect and has irregularities to it to kind of go along with the build. So just making sure that it's kind of proud and not exactly perfect as it goes along. So this rear fender section for the COE is complete, and what I ended up doing was just making two rear fenders. I have no idea what they're supposed to be for. They were similar to design to what was on the Welderup, and so I just made that shape, and then just made a huge form to get this piece spanned in the middle. And when I looked at the design, it was not perfectly smooth over. It looked like it was, the kind of sheet metal and just kind of not perfectly joined here. So that's what I did. I left the rollover edge and made it protrude up and not be kind of even along here to give that kind of same design. Glued this all together, and it's going to reside somewhere in this vicinity back here. So what I'm going to end up doing is extending off of this box with some styrene and then gluing this all together, so this will be one piece. So let's just get to that. So now that I have this rear section complete, I needed to be able to attach it to the front. And so what I'm going to end up doing is just taking some styrene, gluing it to the wooden piece, and then having that glued straight up to this that rear section. I end up with a piece underneath the wooden box, and I come back later with one that's flush with the top. And so what that does, it gives me almost like a beam, the way that thing is made in there. So it's very strong and secure from that wooden box to that rear fender section. But I still want to come back at some point in the future and add a support underneath the very rear of this, because it will hold it up, and I don't think there's an issue with it breaking off or causing any problems, but it's going to flop around and it just won't look right. So what I'm going to probably end up doing is putting my electronics behind the rear axle. There's a huge amount of space behind that rear axle under that fender. Make a bracket to hold the electronics, and then make some kind of a bracket that can hook up to that rear fender section and kind of give it some support under the rear. Trying to match that angle where it goes up against the rear fender, and so that way you can have a much better glue joint if you have more surface area attached. So while I got the one made up, I might as well go ahead and at least get the other one marked up. It probably won't be exact or perfect, but it will be really close and give me a good place to start with anyway. So you really just have to take your time in order to make sure those pieces are going together perfectly. Now that one right there was not quite going down as deep as I wanted, so I had to come back with a razor knife and just kind of keep cutting away until I finally get that thing to slip down to the way I want it to look. So the last thing I'm doing here is working on the steps for the the step side of the cab. So I kind of went back and forth trying to see if I wanted to to scratch build these and to build them with the vacuum mold. And I decided to give it a try. These little pieces are almost a little more, they're almost harder to build than the bigger ones because it's just so hard to hold. These weren't quite so bad, but I've done some others that are just really, really tough. So here I'm just taking some MDF, getting the shape, putting a little backer ledge on it that'll go up to meet the cab, and then to represent some treads, I'm going with some half round. I think it was a 60 thousandths half round. Just gluing those straight down and making sure everything's trimmed up nice and square. I made some really good progress on this build here. One of the last things I was able to get done are the little steps that go on the side. So let's see, essentially it'll go something like this. Now obviously I have to vacuum form over this, but I'm trying, this is just two small pieces, so I'm trying to get a little more material ready to be vacuum formed before I do that. So I think I'll work on getting the interior before I do these vacuum forms. I also have the rear pretty close to complete. This rear fender section is done, this like rolled sheet metal look, a wooden box, a nice little transition. Still a lot more details to add to this. Obviously I still have to get the suspension working and some brackets to hold the motor, the suspension for the front. There's still a lot more to go, but I think I've got a pretty good ways along with getting this COE put together. Still a lot more to go. A lot of fun and interesting things coming up. Until then, we'll see you on the rocks.